We've got a mic. Can you hear me? I can hear myself, so I assume you do. My name is Matt Ross. I'm the editor of Civil Service World, the newspaper. Thanks very much for coming to this session, which will be on transparency, something which is very much, I suppose, in the limelight at the moment. Is very core to quite a few of the things the coalition is doing, I'd have thought, especially localism in the big society, stretching as control over local services stretches down to the local level as well as at the centre. Accountability will have to follow that, and transparency is a key way of enabling that to happen alongside the more traditional routes upwards through the centre. Here we've got three excellent speakers on that today, so we'll have a few minutes from them and then have a chat around the topic. If we start with Tim Kelsey, immediately to my right, he's the Director of Transparency at Cabinet Office. Second is Amias Morse, the Comptroller and Auditor General of the National Audit Office. And then we have Bernard Jenkin MP, who's the Chair of the Public Administration Select Committee. We'll have a few words from each of them. If I could ask Tim first.
Sure. Today is a really big day. I don't know how many of you will have followed a bit of the media this morning, but today the Prime Minister launched his new series of commitments on transparency, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And I think we'll come back to look at today, hopefully not as the day on which the news of the world just went into total crisis, but I hope the day on which we can look back and say something really significant happened in relationship to open data becoming real in public services. But I'll come back to that in a second. I just wanted to first of all tell you really quickly who I am, because I think it will help you kind of in a way understand where we're going to be driving policy from, and perhaps also ways in which we can bring this really important agenda more positively to life for frontline public service providers and the civil service as well. So 12 years ago, I was actually a journalist. I was the news editor at the Sunday Times, and I got a phone call from my mother. She's a GP, she was a GP, and she was in charge of breast cancer screening in the southwest of England, and she had referred 3 patients to a local radiological consultant at the local hospital and had heard nothing back, and these patients had not been called for an appointment, and very sadly 2 of them then died, having heard nothing, not having been seen by the hospital doctor. She reported the doctor to the local hospital. The hospital investigated, and eventually it was discovered that he was an alcoholic. He'd been sticking mammograms quite literally down the back of his radiator and not taking any notice of the patients, and the total number of ladies whose lives were either severely shortened or actually quite literally terminated as a result, they estimated into around 50, but 11 deaths were positively ascribed to that doctor's negligence. And the reason this triggered for me a big life change was because it emerged very quickly that the data that would have identified that negligent doctor was absolutely available to the administration of the hospital at the time. They just didn't look at it. So I left the Sunday Times and I set up a company called Dr. Foster, which has tried hard and I think has made some real progress in publishing outcomes in healthcare, death rates and so on, to try and just bring to life some of the tough decisions that the NHS needs to make to ensure that we do have a safe, reliable health service. And actually it's done an awful lot to really address itself to that issue. Mid Staffordshire, another tragedy, 400 people probably having lost their lives. That only came to light actually because we had transparency. We were able to point out on this occasion that hospital was massively underperforming on its mortality rates, and as a result, finally, admittedly a little bit too late, the regulator took notice and went in, and we hopefully will now improve the quality of that service for the people of the West Midlands. Anyway, so I very recently, 6 weeks ago, was asked by the Prime Minister if I would sort of bring some of that learning from Dr. Foster and from some of the other things I've done. I also set up NHS Choices, the NHS Information Service, and a few other things, to bear on the national agenda around transparency. And that's what, in a way, today's announcement is largely about, because we are going to move the narrative around open data away from the very important role it plays in simply delivering political accountability, central government spending, civil service organograms. I'm sure for many of you that it's frankly really tiresome type stuff, but actually it will lead to a cultural shift which as citizens I think we should all take seriously. But I actually want to try and move the narrative off just accountability. It's important, but it's not really the big game. The big game for transparency is all about outcomes in public services. We need to publish data which will help us as professionals, help the service users, the patients, the parents, the victims of crime, actually learn about the degree to which a particular service is delivering value for them, help them make choices, and help the service improve its productivity and outcomes. And that's why in the letter the Prime Minister has launched today, there are a series of, I think, really important commitments to, for example, publish for the first time data on clinical teams in hospitals so that we can look at the relative performance across basically every specialty in healthcare of our doctors in hospitals. We can, for the first time, literally in the world, we'll be publishing data that allows you to benchmark the quality of your local general practice. That's a really important breakthrough, particularly, of course, given the reform emphasis on GPs having a role in dispersing the funds of the NHS. At the moment, we have no insight into how good or bad or indifferent GPs currently are, and we need to make some progress there. The message I was hoping to sort of leave you with today, and I'm truncating what I would say just in the interest of only having a few minutes, is that there are really 6 ways to quickly think about transparency. And if there's one thing you could take away from this, is sort of, that would be great. And the first one is accountability, and we've discussed that, and I think that's familiar to everybody. The second one is choice. I think choice is an important aspiration, but in most public service contexts, it's going to come slowly. And my mother is not going to deselect her GP based on data that I produce, but my son might. And I think that there's a very important political commitment to choice which is real, but we must recognise in the short term that choice won't probably be the driver of the sorts of changes we want in our public services. The third key reason for transparency is public service productivity. There is now really good evidence that when you give meaningful data to doctors, to teachers, actually what they do with it is they improve the quality of their service, and they do so in a more efficient way. We have Bruce Keogh was speaking this morning at the launch of the Prime Minister's letter. He's the medical director of the NHS, and he pioneered the publication of heart surgery outcomes in the NHS. In 5 years since those outcomes were first published by individual doctor, death rates have fallen for those doctors collectively by more than 20%, which equates to 1,000 people living when they wouldn't have done had that data not been published each year. So we think that productivity, and related to productivity, is public service outcomes. So that is about saving lives. It's about giving our children a much better chance in our schools. And actually, it's also about helping victims of crime track the kinds of crime that are committed in order that they will, in future, continue to report those crimes. So we've got lots of sort of transformational data sets related to public service productivity, which is the third driver, and public service outcomes, which is the fourth. And the fifth driver, cantering through it, relates to what I call social growth. It's an awful phrase, but what I mean by that is online public services. I mean having data that is available on which people can start making different kinds of decisions. We're used to online banking, and all online banking is we're given our data by the banks. In return, we do all their work for them. We fill in all their forms, we make all their transactions. They don't need their clerks anymore because we, in a delighted way, are now doing all their work for them. And we need the same sleight of hand to take place in our public services. We need to take a grip on digital productivity, a big theme of this event, and the only way we're going to do that is if we make our data much more freely available to ourselves. And then finally, it's about economic growth. And I'll just leave you with this thought. A McKinsey report very recently forecast that in Europe, the value of the public data assets that are currently concealed from commercial exploitation for no particularly good reasons, just no one's really thought about it, could be worth in the hands of large and small business something in the order of 250 billion euros. And the challenge for me at the Cabinet Office and my colleagues at the Treasury and elsewhere is to start figuring out what slice can UK PLC take from the kinds of industrial opportunities that exist with our data. And I'm believing it's a pretty big slug of that 250 billion euros. And that is all I'm going to say for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Ines, do you want to step up?
Sure. I think I'll talk about this from the perspective of the National Audit Office. You won't be surprised to hear. And I think it's quite important, thinking about information and transparency, to understand that the reports we publish are all agreed as to fact by the departments, or virtually all agreed as to fact by the departments concerned. So they are a public record of fact, and we are now using that as a knowledge asset to start driving more information and actually reflecting what we know about and what we're seeing across the whole of the public sector, to try to drive more offer more information back to the public sector and drive more consistent analysis. So the reaction to transparency is really based on what I want to try and talk about is what the transparency agenda might mean for government, rather than, I know it's important to talk about what it means for the citizen. We've just heard a bit of that. I want to talk about what it might mean for government. The NEO focuses on information and informed government as one of its first and probably most important single strategic theme. We don't think that we see information used effectively in government. The characteristics of information that are important is that it should be well aligned, should be comparable, it should be reusable for a number of different purposes. It should be, as far as possible, standardized. In fact, there's no point having people describing information in different ways. Different categories means it can't, again, be used and aggregated, and if you make it public, it's not meaningful. It's got to be provided with a reasonable amount of context as to the circumstances in which that information was generated. And it's got to be timely, and very importantly, it's got to be of right quality. And don't imagine that information quality comes cheap. It really doesn't. You have to work very hard to get information to the right level. So there are a lot of things about having good information, and if you just put any information out into the public domain, it's probably a healthy thing to do, but if it doesn't have some of the characteristics I've described, what you'll get is a lot of response of a fairly unstructured kind. You'll get a lot of challenge, you'll get a lot of questions. Some of them will be good and not bad to ask them, but some of them will be very difficult to respond to because you'll be saying, well, I can't actually relate to the information you've picked up, or I don't know where you got it from, or it doesn't reconcile. So there will be and that will have quite a considerable effect on the general public. In other words, if we don't have consistency and a consistent strategy and quality towards information being published, I think it may do good in the long term, but it will also be quite confusing and possibly alarming. Now, that's not an argument against sharing information or against transparency. I am very much in favour of it, but I think it is an argument for recognising that it has profound implications for how people in government need to work in future, because you have to assume that most of what you do is going to be visible, and you have to assume that you're going to need to be able to explain it rather than assuming that you can not explain it or only explain it in vaguely general terms. So I think there are very significant implications for the way government does its business and takes its decisions in future. I think that we will have to find information and decisions coming from information being made in a rather significantly different way. And what do I mean? Well, we have a lot of examples of information which would be contrary to the direction which a department might be going in, not being used or being ignored. And our reports show substantial examples of that. We did a report quite recently on pathways to work, where there was a trial to see if the interventions on pathways to work were likely to be effective, and it was quite clear from that trialing that there were serious issues, but they went ahead anyway. And surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, it didn't work very well. So inconvenient information or inconvenient implications of risk in particular need to be dealt with and engaged with, not ignored and brushed aside by people feeling that they might not be taking a positive enough attitude. Much of what government does is very difficult. It's not the same as business. It often undertakes things that business would not undertake. And therefore, if you're trying to engage in a social problem or something of that sort, if you say, let's say the National Drugs Program, you decide you want to engage with the National Drugs Program and drive improvement, you don't know what is going to work. It'd be great if you admitted you don't know what's going to work and say, we're going to try a few things, we're going to test the data, and depending on what we find, so we will evolve and develop our approach. Now, that's not generally the way it works. It generally works, we've got the answer, we'll tell you what it is, we'll make an announcement about a huge amount of money, and we'll keep going for a long period of time. A more adaptive approach and a more frank approach as to what we don't know would allow government to shift and develop and adapt to information. And in other words, for much of what government does, it's actually carrying out a bit of a research project. Very often, no one's ever done this before in the way it's being done. That doesn't mean it shouldn't do it. I am not trying to discourage that. I'm simply saying, let's not pretend that there isn't risk that's genuinely there. And so, very often we see, and I have the job of writing reports where we're reporting on projects which have failed. I've just produced a report on fire control, which was a signal failure and wasted a great deal of public money. If we'd admitted that we didn't know from the beginning whether that project would work and that we really shouldn't go ahead until we had some things lined up, we managed to hold the line on that, that project would never have happened and the money would not have been wasted. So admitting that it's not easy and it's not a pushover and we shouldn't just announce things quickly, and being prepared to give ministers messages they don't particularly want to hear is a crucial part of the way ahead, in my view, and I don't think it will be dispensable in a transparent environment, because what's going to happen is people will have more and more information and they'll be able to say, oh, but look, you didn't do this, you should have done this, and it's going to become more and more difficult to avoid those points. So I really think if we're living in a transparent world, you've got to live with the consequences of that, which will be a change and an inability to ignore evidence and a need to be more evidentially based in the decisions that are made. I don't find that an unwelcome eventuality at all. You will not be surprised to hear me say. So I'd like to see departments using information more seriously. I think their non-executive boards will expect that of them nowadays, and I welcome what's happening in non-executive boards. And I think they'll find that the need to reconcile their decisions and the information they base their decisions on with what the public will think when they see those decisions, or what third parties may think when they see those decisions, is going to drive material change in ways of working in government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amos. And Bernard Jenkin.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity and this invitation to say a few words, and I'll keep my remarks as short as possible because I'm sure you'll do a bit of discussion, I presume. I've just got a very simple comment to add to what my two colleagues have already said, which is that, which arises from an experience I had last year when I attended the conference of the National Statistical Service. All the government statisticians were gathered at the Birmingham NEC, and I was amused but disturbed when I said, well, you know, we're going to have transparency. All this data that you very tightly control at the moment and interpret and regulate and put out very carefully, it's all just going to be out there now, and people are going to be able to make up their own mind about it. And the shock was, well, you can't possibly let that happen, because what would the Daily Mail do with these figures? You know, what would the Guardian or the BBC do with these figures if they weren't properly interpreted and properly understood before they were released on the unsuspecting public? And I think I've got three real messages. I mean, I'm chairman of a select committee. We do scrutiny. We do interpretation of statistics, among other things, and in fact we do regulation of the statistics across government. We are responsible for supervising the UK Statistics Authority, and we've just done the pre-appointment hearing for a candidate for that post, who sadly has decided to withdraw. But we are very interested in this subject, and but all select committees are actually part of a process of being intermediaries. And I think the role of intermediaries as we go into this world of open data is going to become much more important. I think intermediaries like Dr. Foster, I'm so pleased that Tim is now in the Cabinet Office influencing this, because you're not going to be sidelined if you're a statistician or if you're a civil servant responsible for putting out information. In fact, your role is going to become even more important because you are the first intermediary. What we cannot have, what will not create, and I think this was Ameas's point as well, what does not create accountability is just dumping masses of data onto the internet and saying, well, that's it, our job's over. We put it all into the public domain. I can imagine ministers fobbing off members of parliament with written answers which simply say the information is available on such and such a website, go and look at it yourself. I mean, that is not going to be sufficient because we need this data interpreted and managed. We want more independent intermediaries like Dr. Foster. We want more third-party, offline, non-governmental intermediaries interpreting the data as well and being able to reinterpret the way the government has interpreted open data. And open data is a prerequisite of moving away from that world of, as Tim Bell once put it, we have moved from the world of deference to the world of preference. People will no longer accept what is handed down to them by authorities. They want to choose they want to choose their schools and their doctors and their public service. They want to choose which holiday to go on, what car they drive, but they want to be able to choose how information is given to them. I mean, we have far more television channels and far more media outlets, and be able to choose how their data is being interpreted, just like choosing a newspaper. But we cannot have, and I think this is a great danger we face, that people in authority will think we've done our job just by dumping the data onto the internet and letting the public get on with it. I think the role of government itself to provide intelligible data as well as the raw data is as important. Otherwise, I mean, for example, committees like mine will be sifting, we'll have to employ the statisticians to interpret the data. Maybe that would be a better way of doing it, but I don't think we're going to get the money to do that very soon. So we're going to rely on you to make open data a real step forward rather than a fog of information which is designed to obscure what's really going on. And I do think also that we need to, there's a coda to what I'm saying, is the great gain in this is that we stop filtering the data because we're worried about how the public might misinterpret it. We stop insulting people in authority and management in the health service, for example, by giving them very narrow data on which to base targets. We give them all the data so that they can make up. So we delegate that authority to down the food chain of our public services, so they decide, can interpret all the data, and they can decide how better to manage their public services. We shouldn't be insulting the intelligence of voters or public servants down the food chain. They are perfectly capable of making up their mind what a good school is, and looking at the various exam data or league table data and working out in their own minds what the ethos of their school is and what statistics indicate that their school is performing, rather than defining narrow characteristics, which is the old top-down target culture, which I think the government wants to get rid of. A few thoughts. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Right, I think we have about half an hour, and I think we have at least one roving microphone, I hope. There's one question I'd like to ask first, though, which is about comparability of data, because I mean, it touches on things that each of you have mentioned, actually. So far, we've seen, for example, local authorities publishing enormous amounts of data on their spending, but it's not clear to anyone how it was gathered and the methodology, and therefore you can't make meaningful comparisons. I'm sure, Tim, in the work we've done on, for example, today's announcements, you've set out some of that. But in an era of localism where people are to be allowed to make local decisions, to what extent should the centre define the methodologies, the baselines, the presentation?
Well, let me do, one thing I didn't mention when I was talking earlier is that in a couple of weeks' time we're going to be publishing the National Transparency and Open Data Strategy for consultation, and it's a very much green paperish type consultation, and views are greatly welcome. In particular, this focus on standards, and there's no question that the Centre has a fundamental role in setting standards for the collection of data precisely so that it can be comparable. We are talking here about the release of granular episode level data. So we are talking also to some degree about metrics, but we're really talking about giving people the opportunity to make their own metrics. And so the standards we're interested in setting are standards related to the actual collection of the raw data, the underlying data, and then making that available in suitably anonymized or pseudonymized ways to whoever is interested. So data standards, I think, is a fundamental role for central government. That isn't contradictory to the notion that there should be flexibility in local data collection or metrics development. That is merely saying that all doctors throughout the NHS should have access to a standardised basic record from a GP or from a hospital, which they can then use to customise it to whichever metrics they find useful. And just on that point, going to Bernard's thing about worrying about the dumping of data, if we end up with data being dumped that is not being used by professionals or by in the internal world of service delivery, then the data probably isn't of any real value. So I'm actually optimistic that we won't end up in the medium term with just vast amounts of dumped, pointless data, because the only data we're really interested in is data which is as useful to the professional as it is to the public. And where we've seen this happen, we've seen it's the heart doctors that develop the methodology to determine what is a death rate in heart surgery. And actually, once they've done their work so that it works for them, the general public can have confidence that they understand what the meaning of that measure actually is. So all we want to do is give the professionals the data, they manage the metrics, and then everyone kind of is talking the same language. Does that make any sense?
Just very briefly, obviously the maintenance of data series, long-running data series, is going to be absolutely vitally important. I think one of the questions over the future of the census is about whether we maintain data series. But on the question of data dumping, I mean, I think it's absolutely brilliant that government departments and local authorities are publishing all this spending information. But if you've ever tried to look at it, you do wonder what it means. And I think if we're going to produce all this information, it is incumbent upon government departments and local authorities themselves actually to place this information in some kind of context, so it does actually mean something. And also to deliver this data in a usable format, in recognized software formats that can be capable of manipulation, so that it comes in an Excel spreadsheet or it comes in a database, so that the information is actually usable by professionals and can be manipulated. And we don't want PDF format documents with data on it, which is virtually unusable. I don't know if I'm repeating what somebody else has said.
No, you're just on that. I'm sorry, I won't go on. But in the strategy, which I'd really encourage everyone to take a look at when it comes out and come back with comments, there are going to be some quite fundamental changes proposed around the requirement that under Freedom of Information and other legislation, government departments and their funded providers and commissioners will have to publish all data in machine-ready, open-sourced, applicable environments. So we obviously need to stop this behaviour which has happened of people publishing PDFs and claiming that's transparency, which is not. That is just anti-transparency. So there's quite a lot of stuff that needs to go on. Now, I'm not saying I've just landed, so can you give me a shot? But the stuff, there's no doubt that the quality of data that's so far been published in relation to the existing commitments around spending is lamentably poor. And actually, data.gov itself is not particularly accessible. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done just to get the standards up, data quality together. But all I can really communicate is we are making real progress. And hopefully users of that data will see that pretty bloody quickly, or you need to tell me, and we will remedy it. I've had some terrible examples of ways in which industrial users, armchair auditors, etc., simply cannot get access to data which is actually already published in forms which are so opaque and difficult to, so we're dealing with it. But yeah.
It is telling that Treasury, having struggled internally with publishing its coins database and patted itself on the back for having done so, I didn't see a single news story emerging after that, because actually the reporters actually can't really make head or tail of the data or interpret it. So, Amy, as we look at this strategy, are there any things that you'll be particularly looking for or suggesting we need to incorporate?
Well, I think what I would mostly suggest is that people, I don't think, and I think there's nothing wrong with making data available, but I think what we just said is if you dump masses of technical data out there, you're going to get incomprehension from most of the people, unless they're specialist users. And then what you may get is them taking your data, doing something with it, and coming back and giving you a message. And you're then going to have an interesting time explaining, is that message right or wrong? Yeah. So, we could get a whole industry of arguing about what the data that's being put out means, on top of the fact that it's low quality. So I think I love the idea that, and I genuinely am very supportive of the idea of transparency in information. I actually, about now, really sound like an accountant. I really would say not too precipitate, because you've probably got a certain amount of time when the public isn't going to be deeply cynical about this. And if what happens is you put loads of data out and it's quite obviously not particularly useful or informative, and it's mostly sort of low to rubbish grade, what will happen, unless it rises up pretty fast, which is not cheap, remember, and you've got to think, how's that going to work when I have the discussion with the local authorities having progressive cuts in their budget over the next few years, and you say, oh, did I mention that you're also got to pay for cleansing your data to put it out, and you've got to be able to deal with all the questions that will arise from it, in addition to what you normally do. You've got to think about that and say, so if we want this to be alive and credible, what's the maximum, the ambition, the big ambition, but then also what's the credible delivery that will mean something to people, where we can say we've really done something about this policy and it's worked, even if things turn out to be a bit tough. And I think that, what I call a risk-weighted approach to implementing the transparency agenda isn't such a bad idea, because as you gather from my earlier remarks, I don't encounter it all that often in the implementation of policy in government.
And we should open it up, but I'd just like to say I take a slightly different view there, respectfully, which is that if we don't move, we haven't got time on this one. It's not to do with public demand. Actually, we won't have large swathes of public services unless we get to a different kind of arrangement between user and service, and the key to that is information and data. And so as a result, I'm hoping, and the Prime Minister and everyone else seems to be wanting to move very precipitately, because I want to create a tidal wave of opportunity for both professionals and patients as quickly as I can, in order that we flush out some of these really difficult issues. So the only way we're going to get high quality data is it's published. It will be painful. In healthcare, we published data on hospitals 10 years ago, granular data that allowed Dr. Foster, for example, to calculate mortality rates. There were huge rows about whether that was the right or the wrong methodology. The data was rubbish, but actually, within 3 years, the data went from rubbish to really quite useful, because what happened was the doctors went down the corridors for the first time in their lives, they met the coding clerks, they actually started to take it pretty seriously, because if they didn't, what was going to be published in the Sunday Times, the Daily Telegraph, whatever, was going to be completely wrong. And there was a big incentive to actually get on with data quality. So my view is we need to get it out as quickly as possible, particularly so that we can improve it, and recognise that we, as society, need to just sort of there will be things we can't predict happening, but what we can, when we look at other examples like online banking, like e-ticketing and airlines, actually we move really quickly. Online banking in 12 years has gone from 0 to 22 million adult users in this country, 2/3 of the population more or less, and most of us can't even conceive of a different way of doing it. And I don't know how many people here but have had this experience, but I know of no one whose record's been lost or their privacy compromised, or they just got on and did it. And that's sort of my attitude to how we need to do this in the public sector as well.
I don't know of anyone whose security has been compromised on online banking.
No.
Can I just add one thing, which is I tend to agree with Tim on this, that yes, intelligible data has got to be put out, but the raw data has got to go out too, because people have got to be able to see how, we all know, for a very simple example, how schools game their targets by putting their pupils through different types of exams or pulling people out of exams. They're not going to do well enough in the grades, so they don't pull down the averages. And we need to see all that data to really know how good a school is. You can't just look at the cleansed data. And I remember, I think it was you telling me about how when you got behind some of these hospital data about, say, waiting times in A&E, how hospital managers had cleaned up their data to make it look so much better than it actually was. So the raw data is a vital check on what is presented as clean data. And that is a real improvement in accountability, albeit you're going to get occasions when unscrupulous people like politicians grab bits of data and jump to the wrong conclusion, but that's never happened before, has it? I think that's just part of the weather.
Right, thank you. Tim has to leave a little early, so I'd like to have him answer a couple of questions from the floor first. So perhaps there's a gentleman here, and then if we'll take your question as well at the same time.
Hi, thanks very much. I think there's some really great benefits from transparency, so environmental information perhaps from the local businesses and what have you, getting that out there and companies using it to give apps on iPhones and that kind of stuff. But isn't there sort of two questions here? One sort of, isn't the risk of all this information being dumped that some of it's of no value at all? And is there going to be sort of reviews at some point or just general periodic, we're spending all this time and money putting information out there, is there any point? Is anyone using it? And the second was a sort of slight challenge back to Amir, so it's dangerous for a civil servant, I'm not sure. But you're saying the sort of putting information out there is going to help us make better policy because people will challenge you as things go out there and what have you. But I sort of actually wonder if it will influence the policy making, because all that information is available to civil servants anyway, it's just not out available to the public. So it should be factored into the kind of advice we put to ministers, and then they make the decisions and off you go. So I sort of just actually wonder if it is going to make a huge difference in the policy making process.
Thanks. Sorry, can we take your question as well? We'll answer all together.
Hello. As a government statistician, I was encouraged to hear the views of the panel in terms of the respect of our role in the future, or importance of statisticians in the future. But how do you think we should tackle bias or incorrect analysis or misinterpretation of data in the future? And I'd also like to add that it's not transparency when national statistics are ended. For example, the citizenship survey was cut. They've cut the funding for it, and it was the only real measure of the big society. So it's not transparent to end statistics as well.
Thank you. Tim?
Right. So as you'll see from the strategy, we need to reduce the data burden. So I've just talked about open data, getting it all out. Actually, I want that to be partly about reducing red tape and the pointless collection of pointless data. So one of the things we're going to consult on is how can we start constructing a methodology for development of inventories for different public services and sources of data which are prioritized around actually being useful. So the strategy is focused on the embedding of a right to data, but the key word is a meaningful right to data. We're not going to prejudge what may or may not matter to people, but we need to come up with a way in which we can reduce the burden of data collection on public services whilst actually getting the most useful data out there as quickly as possible. And we think there's something important about the construction of a new kind of approach to inventories. It's something which is very common in the private sector. It's how the US insurance industry is largely arranged, but it'll be new for this sector. And then just on the statistical interpretation, there's a real, and to be honest, this is an act of political bravery overall. I mean, basically, on one level, government is saying it's going to give up its monopoly on kind of knowing the inside story and let other people develop their own versions of that inside story. And there will be conflicting interpretations of the data. You know, you have the Dr. Foster mortality rate and other people's mortality rate. They don't always tell the same story, but we're kind of used to that. I think we can make our own decisions to some degree, and people will just have to argue their corner on the different interpretations. What we are specifically saying, though, is that it may well be that government no longer has the monopoly on the correct, as it were, interpretation of a particular data set. That is one of the features of this whole agenda. We are going to allow other people into that conversation.
And on his point on cuts to data collection,
Sorry.
you mentioned there was a cut to I can't remember which citizenship survey. Yes, if we're reducing the money for collecting data, is that not going to be a problem in this?
Well, that's a good point. That relates to something somebody else said about the how the costs. Sorry, it's talking about the costs of data collection. I mean, there is definitely going to be. We have huge gaps in our insight into public services, and there will need to be infrastructure developed to cover those gaps. We don't even report data on mental health or social care meaningfully. That will be very expensive. We're building universal credit, which is great, but we need to have an exhaust pipe that feeds out data to the public on the back of it. That's going to cost tens of millions of pounds to deliver. So the question is, if we have to move to new models of working, and another part of the consultation looks at whether or not actually we could be talking to industry about defraying those costs. They're the ones who want the data. So how about they have some joint venture type engagement in paying for the upfront infrastructure costs of that data. So I think we need to open a different kind of collaborative conversation with the user community, which is big business as well as individual users, and say we have to work together on managing these costs, because there will actually be costs. In terms of government cutting, there have been examples. We cancelled the Audit Commission, or government did, and as a result we've lost a big swathe of crucial, in my view, indicators related to the national indicator set. That just has sort of happened, and we have to find ways around that, which we will.
Thank you. Amos?
Well, you asked me a specific question, and let me answer it. I think, of course, it's not going to be the case that every time from now on everybody will make decisions differently as a result of these changes. But what I would say is this: the more people who can persistently examine decisions, and I don't think the obligation if you go policy making through to implementation, what you very often find, and actually it's been quite interesting because I've just been listening to it, is that you have a policy and then there's a very accelerated implementation because it's very urgent, we can't wait, we must get it done now. Now, sometimes that's fine, and sometimes it's a disaster. And I'm not saying which one it will be, because I don't know. No. But I have seen a lot of examples where, as a result of the hurry and the huge importance of it, the normal steps that might be prudently taken, and again, I'm really not trying to apply this to you, because I don't know enough about it to say that, don't get taken. And therefore, the link between policy idea and the actual implementation is one which is too abbreviated and too precipitate and not based on hard information. And I actually almost bored with the number of examples of that I see where basic good practice has been ignored. And I don't mean slow, I mean things to slow it down, just things that you would imagine. I'm going to give you the example again of our recently published report on fire control, where there was an assumption that a lot of fire authorities would move from their local locations into central control and stop having their local controllers and move into central facilities. The difficulty was, when the contract was signed, nobody had agreed to do that. And in fact, they'd made it clear that they didn't like the idea. And you know what? They never did agree. So these buildings were constructed, and unfortunately they were constructed early, and then only much later was the radio equipment, was the IT equipment to stack up calls constructed. So they stood empty for a long time with no capability, and then finally the technology project started, and that was a failure. So apart from that, it all went really well. Now, the point is, everyone should have done something about, there were steps that any common sense person would say should have been taken in a certain sequence, and I'm afraid the facts show that if you don't do that, you do ignore it at your peril. And if you don't do it and you don't demand a letter of direction, you, the civil servant, are responsible for it, and you can't get around that. So now you're going to have more and more people able to see that, which will mean it's harder not to pick those issues up. Not impossible, but harder, and it'll get harder and harder to ignore the evidence or to say, oh, well, we're in a big hurry, Minister wants me to get this done fast, I want to look like I could do things very quickly, so I'll just skip some of the rather necessary steps that might be appropriate if I was going to do this with my own money.
Thanks. And Ben?
I'll just add one thing about the role of statisticians in government, because I think it's such an important matter. I mean, the UK Stats Authority has already, I hope, strengthened that sense that you are the guardians of the truth, or as near as the truth as statistics can ever take us, the guardians of impartial interpretation of statistics. And you should be regarded like lawyers. Your advice is in private, but the minister should be obliged to take your advice or have very, very good reason not to take your advice. And I think one of the reasons why the government's preferred candidate for the new chairmanship, the new chair of the UK Stats Authority, withdrew is because I don't think the government and us actually share a common view about the role of the UK Stats Authority. We think it should be a powerful and aggressive regulator. We think it should be Parliament's enforcer of impartial statistics, and we want it to be able to be a back channel for people to blow the whistle when your arm is being twisted to do something that you know isn't right, so that this becomes something much rarer and becomes something of the past. We want the UK Statistics Authority to become more proactive in promoting creative and positive use of statistics in perhaps ways that many in the statistical service feel is not being exploited by the government or is not available to policymakers at the moment. We want to strengthen your position in the decision-making processes in government departments, and the UK Stats Authority has got to be the vehicle to do that. And the post of the chair is going to be re-advertised. We are in discussion with the government about how that recruitment should be managed, so that we don't finish up with the same kind of misunderstanding that we've just had. Principally, we think there should be, rather than having the Cabinet Secretary and the Permanent Secretary from the Treasury on the panel, which I have to tell you, I know at least two candidates who would have been very able and suitable candidates for the post simply didn't bother to apply because they didn't think they had a chance of getting past those gatekeepers. That may well be a misunderstanding or misappreciation of the intentions of the recruitment panel, but it's a perception that's got to be understood that people expect regulation of statistics to be a fairly adversarial business and not an inside job, which is what the recruitment panel made it look like. So I'm hoping we're going to have a very different recruitment process. I hope there'll be an independent parliamentarian on the panel, as well as a couple of other outsiders. And as we re-advertise the post, tell your friends if they're suitable candidates to apply.
Yeah, my reporter listened in on your hearing with Dame Janet Finch, and when she came back to me, she thought that you'd pressed her particularly on her readiness to stand up to ministers and had found her answers, in her opinion, she said they were a bit woolly. Are you particularly, you're looking for somebody who will be ready to challenge government, particularly?
Are we on the record here?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. I wanted to tell a story about the Prime Minister, but it'll have to
You
wait.
can go off the record for that if you want.
But Sir Michael Scholar, the existing incumbent, has drawn blood on occasion, and indeed drew blood from the official opposition on one occasion. And I think he set a standard in that role of extraordinary rigour and devotion to the cause and complete courage and integrity. And we want to see that taken a stage further. And I don't think Dame Janet saw herself in that role.
Thank you. And I think I'm the only reporter here. We'll go off the record for the story about the PM.
No, you put me off.
No. Have you got further questions from the audience? No? No, actually, you do on the right-hand side here. There's a gentleman here.
One of the things that's happened to us as a species is that in the last 30 years we've begun to use computers as typewriters. And the best way to communicate when you use typewriters to record the first version of useful words about the present is to copy the new words together so that all journalists can see the latest information about each breaking news story as the stuff happens. We can see all around us the dumbing down of all news and the salacious practices of my honoured profession. And we have had a similar breakdown of trust in MPs and in all kinds of authority. And one of the reasons for this is that we have not actually had a public inquiry into what would be a sensible way to communicate by putting all new information together so that it is a full and fair description of the global present. Now that's a new possibility that didn't exist before computing, and my question is whether this might interest the PASC and might be a way to bring an independent element into bringing fairness to the description of.
Can I just answer that? First of all, I think the dumbing down of news is a feature of cutthroat competition in the newspaper industry, which is, dare I say, as a mass market industry, is in a state of crisis, and particularly amongst the local newspapers. It's also, I think, a problem at the BBC. They don't quite know how to balance. They justify their license fee by having a very large audience, but actually their charter isn't about the size of their audience. The charter is about the quality of the news output, and I don't think they wrestle with that nearly enough, and they finish up chasing audience. So a select committee is reported on Radio 4 as a group of MPs, as though the public on Radio 4 don't know what a select committee is. But I mean, they don't even explain that a select committee, it's just, the constant, you just wonder how stupid they think we are some of the time. I think your solution to this problem, that there should be sort of one central source of truth, I mean, it sounds rather Orwellian to me. I think the... Except that I do think that as individuals and as MPs or ministers or public figures, or we're all entitled to say what we think is appropriate, and therefore we're entitled to control our own message. So I don't think you can do away with some kind of control over it. It can't be a single control, and therefore I think you have to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Unless I've misunderstood your proposal, perhaps we should talk later. Thank you very much.
I think we are out of time now. I'll just add on that particular point, actually. I told you, there are serious problems with today's media. The places where we're safe, actually, where we are kept honest as journalists, and are the places where we're writing for a narrow professional audience who really understand their subject, and there we cannot afford to make mistakes. This is really the only place today where you can actually trust what you read. So on that basis, I'm sure you can trust what you read in the civil service world, but not the broader ones. We'll have to draw it to a close. Before we do, I just want to point out that at 4:30 we've got our final session of Civil Service Live, which is question time with Gus O'Donnell, Peter Jones, the entrepreneur, Baroness Hogg, who's the lead non-exec director at HM Treasury, and Paula Venables, who's chief exec of the Post Office. And thank you very much. Tim has had to rush off, but Amos Morse and Bernard Jenkin, thank you very much indeed for your time.
So much more than just words could ever say.